Hello and welcome to part 1 of the Art of Argumentation PowerPoint. This is a lengthy PowerPoint because it's meant to be a review of all the skills you will need to succeed in global perspectives. So whether or not you've taken thinking skills before, this will help cement a strong foundation to do well on all the global papers. Basically, what I need you to be able to do by the end of all this is be able to get any passage, whether it's for paper 1 or paper 2, and be able to identify the main conclusion, locate the reasons and determine if the reasons are supported with evidence or examples, label everything as you do that, assess the source's reliability using an acronym called RAVEN, determine if it's inductive or deductive before you look for any strengths or flaws. Pretty basic, but there's a lot of facets that go into each step. So it's going to take us about 7 to 8 weeks to get through it all. So let's begin really simply by reviewing the difference between a conclusion and a reason. They're both part of an argument. Every passage you get is going to have one argument, one main thing that they're trying to prove to the reader. So obviously they need a conclusion, kind of like a thesis when we're writing an essay for English, for example, that declares something that you should or shouldn't believe, and then the reasons that are used to support that. So for instance, in this very simple example that says, I want to have children and I believe that children should grow up in a stable family, therefore I should get married. The argument is I should get married, which is encapsulated in that very conclusion. And then the author uses 2 reasons to support that. I want to have children, and I believe children should grow up in a stable family. You always want to begin with the conclusion first. It gives you an idea of where they stand, and then you can go back through the passage looking for the reasons they use to support that conclusion, and then you look for the evidence, examples, or in a deductive argument, you look for premises. Reasons may act independently or jointly. So in the previous example, the reasons were acting jointly because wanting to have children and wanting the children to grow up in a stable environment go hand in hand. You can't separate them. If, on the other hand, I'm arguing about the harms of abortion and I go through the psychological effects as opposed to the physical health effects, those 2 things don't necessarily rely on one another. So those are independent reasons. So the little visual you see here clearly indicates the difference between the 2. A little more tricky, though, is being able to tell an intermediate conclusion from an overall conclusion. You should have done this in thinking skills, but if you're brand new to this, your overall conclusion, that's your thesis. That's the one that the author's trying to prove. And they're kind of easy to find because they tend to come either in the first paragraph or the very last paragraph. And my experience has been 90% of the time, it will be in the last paragraph. Not always. Sometimes they could put it in the second, but more often than not, it'll be in the last paragraph, and it'll have a word like should or thus, therefore in it. Now, intermediate conclusions, think of those like topic sentences in an essay you write, where pretty much every body paragraph will have a topic sentence. It's basically a reason that's so large it could have its own essay on just that reason. So they're stepping stones towards the main conclusion. Now, these tend to come in the beginning or end of body paragraphs, and sometimes there's more than one in a body paragraph. So I'll show you a sample of this later. Luckily, there are words, argument indicators that can help signal when there's a reason or a conclusion. Reason indicators tend to be because words, because they're trying to prove the conclusion. So words like because, as, since, due to. Conclusion indicators are like the ones you use in a concluding paragraph in an essay. Therefore, thus, hence, so, it follows, should. Consequently, I've put should in bold because it's one of the most common ones, so look out for it. Now, full disclaimer, not every reason, not every conclusion will have an indicator. So you have to use your common sense to ask yourself, is this a piece of evidence? Is this an example? Is this an explanation? Or is this the main point of this paragraph? Or is this the main point of the whole passage? In that case, it's a conclusion. Intermediate conclusions, by the way, tend to have the same kind of indicator words as conclusions. So look out for those. Lastly, in terms of structure, is looking for evidence versus example. Evidence is something concrete, a fact, a statistical claim, a poll number, research from sources, studies. So if I'm looking at the physical ramifications of a new drug and they did a survey of people who took the drug, that is evidence. If, on the other hand, I then go on to quote specific people who took the drug and how it affected them, that's an example. That's something used to illustrate a reason by providing a specific situation. So again, evidence is something concrete, often numerical, but not necessarily. Think of studies, think of polls, and example is a specific instance of that. All right. So now we're ready to look at a sample passage and break it down based on everything I just taught you about intermediate conclusions, evidence, and examples. First of all, I know this sounds really elementary, FSA style of a tip, but look at the title. Meat-free future in this example should already signal to you, oh, okay, this is going to be about someone arguing against meat eating for vegetarianism. Knowing that helps me sharpen my eye to look for that. And because I told you that more often than not, the main conclusion comes at the very end, I picked an example that does that. So I'm going to skip ahead to the second page of the passage, and you'll notice that I've highlighted in yellow the main conclusion. They're indicator words, thus, should. Thus, we should cut meat from our diets completely and help usher a vegetarian future. So not only were there indicator words, but it ties into the title, meat-free future. So that's why titles can be important. I often tell students, go to the last paragraph before you read anything else to make sure you understand the main conclusion. Because sometimes the passages will start by giving context on the problem. Or they'll start with the other side. They'll start with the counter argument, and sometimes students can get confused. So go to the very end and look for this main conclusion. Everything I've highlighted in green is an intermediate conclusion, a topic sentence, a reason so big it could be its own essay. So for example, if you look at this top paragraph on this second page, a vegetarian diet improves your health. So even though there's no indicator, that's clearly going to be the focus of that paragraph. And ask yourself, could that be an entire essay? Could I write an entire essay on how a vegetarian diet improves health? Yes, that's an intermediate conclusion. In the second paragraph on this page, the last sentence is the intermediate conclusion. Widespread conversion to meat-free diet is our only hope to avoid mass starvation. So again, no indicator, but it's a general enough topic that clearly that was the focus of that paragraph. Everything you see that's underlined, that is evidence. So notice, for example, here in the second paragraph, there's a specific number, 7 billion people in the world, and over 100 years, this will continue to rise. Not very specific, but it is evidence. Later, they give a more specific statistic, so clearly this is all evidence. Down here in the bottom where you see even Lisa Simpson gave up meat after meeting Paul and Linda McCartney, that's an example. Probably not the best example to be using a cartoon to support what you have to say, but it is an example. If I go back to the beginning of the passage, you'll see more intermediate conclusions. The most obvious reason for giving up meat is that killing animals is morally wrong. They gave you a big clue there. They told you this is a reason. And obviously morality would be something you could write a whole essay about. And in the bottom of that paragraph, we should not eat anything that has a brain. Notice the word should, so it has an indicator. And lastly, many animals reared for food suffer intolerable cruelty. All right? And again, everything that's underlined is piece of evidence. And on the bottom here where it says religions insist on slaughtering techniques that seem cruel in the extreme, that's an example. It's vague. They should mention a specific religion that does that, but it is an example. So the first thing you want to do is break it down. Main conclusion, intermediates, evidence examples, or premises. Notice that I am already critiquing some of it. Once you learn all the thinking skills, you tend to do that, but that's okay. At this point, though, really focus on breaking it down. The last thing we're going to cover in this part 1 is assessing the reliability of the source. Once you have a good idea what they're arguing, you need to ask yourself, well, can I even trust this source? So there's a really helpful acronym that many of you should be familiar with. If not, I'm going to go through it now to help you easily remember how you can assess the credibility of an author. And it's called RAVEN. R for reputation, A for ability to see, V vested interest, E expertise, and N neutrality bias. So let's go into further detail, and I phrased this around questions you should ask yourself. Reputation means that that author has some kind of standing in their field. Well, how do I know? Obviously, you do research, or in the case of paper 1, you go by what the test tells you. But see if the author has awards. If they're a journalist, have they won a Pulitzer Prize? If they're a scientist, have they won a Nobel Prize? I mean, these are some of the top echelon of awards, but they clearly indicate this person's reliable. Or do they have a lot of publications? They've been published by various newspapers or really top-notch scientific journals. That all establishes reputation. Or do they have a really strong academic standing because other experts constantly reference them? Like you're researching this topic and their name keeps popping up. Clearly that's reputation. Notice I'm not talking about their degrees. I'm not talking about how many years of experience they have. That's expertise. Another part of reputation is if they have a high level in the company they're at. So are they the CEO? Are they the vice president? Are they the director of this nonprofit? That's another way to think of reputation. Ability to see is as simple as it sounds. The author was there. So if I'm writing about the refugee crisis and I go to Turkey to interview some of these refugees, I have ability to see. Vested interest is a negative. So notice not everything in RAVEN is necessarily positive. Reputation and ability to see were, but not vested interest. Vested interest is a downside. It means that the author wrote this piece, they published this specific stance because they have something to gain by taking this stance. Now, the gain can be financial, the gain can be political, they might be looking for a promotion in their job, there's different things. So think of a politician who's up for re-election and they're suddenly for something that they've never talked about before. But it's because they know this is going to help them win re-election. Do they really believe in this stance, or is it just for political gain? Or I'm interning in a newspaper and I write this inflammatory article against a protest. I only do it because I know my boss is going to like it and give me a promotion. So these kind of things involve you looking into it. Look out for organizations that tend to be very biased. So for example, in Meat Free Future, if the author was part of PETA, which is against human cruelty, there would be potential vested interest. Expertise is easy, just don't confuse it with reputation. Do they have a degree? Or do they have sufficient experience in the field? Maybe I never got a degree, but I've been working on this topic for 12 years. I'm still an expert. And lastly, neutrality versus bias. It's okay to take a stance. That doesn't mean you're biased. If you took a stance because you did a lot of research and you looked at both sides and you ended up against or for something, that doesn't mean you're biased. You're biased if you take that stance because of political affiliations, religious affiliations, a personal affiliation. So that's what you have to consider. So if we go to Meat Free Future and we realize they're this part of this group, PETA, like I said, not only could that be potential vested interest, that could be a bias. If, on the other hand, I'm not part of this group, but I did all the research and I really feel like being vegetarian is the better option, then I have neutrality, and that's a good thing. So if you look at this two examples from an actual paper 1, you kind of notice how you would do this the day of the test really quickly. Based on what the passage tells me, I can see that document 1, they're a doctor, and they're a New York Times bestselling author. Reputation. The fact that they're still practicing medicine means they have ability to see because they have patience, and this also gives them expertise. Similarly, document 2 is also a doctor, so expertise, and they work for the World Health Organization, which is one of the top organizations in the world, and they're the director, so that gives them reputation. So that took you through the basics that we will continue to build on throughout the first quarter of Global.